Bonjour à toutes et à tous. I am honored to present to you today my first report as your Environmental Commissioner. As you may know, I have two main roles. I am the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights, which is a series of procedural tools to allow members of the public to participate in significant environmental decisions. And secondly, I'm a watchdog for the legislature and the people of Ontario on energy conservation, climate, and environmental protection. Today I report on energy conservation in Ontario in 2014 and 2015. Conservation is the cheapest and the cleanest form of energy. La conservation est la source la moins dispendieuse et la plus propre de l'énergie. Since 2007, when our office first reported on energy in Ontario, our population grew about 7%, our economy about 8%, both without increasing total energy use. It's a good step in the right direction. But Ontario's conservation policy is lopsided. We invest heavily in conserving electricity, and electricity consumption has gone down. But electricity is the smallest and the cleanest of our major energy sources, as you can see on the cover of our report. And these graphs are the actual figures, as you'll see in the report. Since Ontario closed the last coal-fired generating station in 2014, we have had very low emission electricity and much cleaner air to breathe. In contrast, Ontario's two largest energy sources are transportation fuel, as you can see at the top of the cover, and natural gas, as you can see in the middle. Both of these are fossil fuels. They have adverse effects on climate and on air quality, and between them, they provide about 73% of our energy use in 2014. In proportion to the energy provided, Ontarians invested less than 1/10 the amount on conserving natural gas that we did on electricity, and even less on conserving transportation fuels. It's therefore no surprise that, other than coal, our total use of fossil fuels has gone up since 2007. We depend on fossil fuels for more than 80% of our energy supply. And you can see on the chart to my left, the cross-hatched areas, those are all fossil fuels. Basically, our only clean energy is electricity, a little bit of biomass. What would it take to get serious about conserving fossil fuels in Ontario? The recommendations on our report are all reasonable, they're all achievable, and they're all based on successful experience here and in other jurisdictions. For example, we recommend that public bodies should get serious about a cleaner, leaner, greener approach to fossil fuels. For a start, we say that public bodies should be accountable to the public for the energy that they use, for the public money that they spend on energy, and for their impact on climate change and on air quality. And the first step in accountability is transparency. Why don't we know which public buildings, organizations, or fleets are energy hogs? Our office has put up a link on our website today to a map, and you'll see a screenshot of the map to my left that shows the energy footprint of every building in the Ontario broader public sector for 2012 to 2014. Check out your community. This means municipal buildings, universities, colleges, schools, and hospitals. And when the federal and provincial governments make their own data available for their buildings, which they should, we will add to the map. There'll be a live demonstration of this map after the press conference by the engineer who developed it, Emily. It's right there. She'll be just outside afterwards. Get her to give you a demo. Now, the map and the report show that Ontario has a huge opportunity to save money and reduce emissions by learning from better public buildings. If all of the buildings in the broader public sector performed as efficiently as the top quarter of the buildings of their type, taxpayers could save $450 million every year and a megaton of greenhouse gas emissions also every year. And this isn't rocket science. Other countries are way ahead of us. Sweden, for example, has decreased its building energy consumption more than 80% in the last 40 years, and it's just as cold there as it is here. We also recommend that Ontario should move towards a level playing field for a sustainable economy. And that means rethinking land use, infrastructure, and tax policies that favor car-dependent suburbs, and tax breaks that subsidize fossil fuel consumption. It means getting the best bang for a transit buck, and it also means setting efficiency standards for products that waste water and energy, and actually enforcing those standards. Ontario knows how to conserve fossil fuels. Air pollution, climate change, and the prudent management of public money tell us why. It's time to get serious about conserving the energy sources that really matter, which are transportation fuels and natural gas. Il est temps de prendre au sérieux la conservation des sources d'énergie qui comptent le plus, les carburants de transport et de gaz naturel. Thank you to my excellent staff who are here to my left and everyone else who helped us to prepare this report. I'll now be glad to take questions.
One of your recommendations is adopting formal targets for reducing fossil fuel consumption. One of the debates that's been going on lately has to do with the government's climate change action plan and potential phase out of natural gas in buildings. Do you think that calling for targets to reduce fossil fuel is going to provoke that same kind of concern among consumers or the fossil fuel industry?
Well, I can't comment on the action plan until it's been released. I think that it's clear that we have to reduce fossil fuel consumption. We have a new law that says that we will. We're going to reduce it 80%, in other words, to 20% of what we used to use. And that means that we have to be enormously more efficient in how we use all fossil fuels, which include natural gas, at least the part of natural gas that is non-renewable. The good news is that Ontario has lots of room to improve. We are, relatively to other people in the world, extremely wasteful. So we have lots of room to reduce our consumption, minimize waste. Technology already exists in Ontario to build net zero homes. And by 2030, every reason to think we'll be even better at it.
I think there's the political will to implement much of what you're suggesting here.
Political will is challenging. The good news is we now have a law, and we are in the same boat as governments around the world. And we are seeing the evidence in the natural world. This is, as I saw a article this morning, no one alive has ever lived through 7 months as hot as the 7 months we've just living through. These are the hottest ever in the world for human civilization. And so we need to adapt, and we need to reduce our consumption, or it won't be possible for us and our children to have reasonably good lives. So one way or the other, we're going to have to reduce our fossil fuel consumption and get ready for the massive change that climate change is bringing. And the good news on buildings is we have lots of good options, particularly for new buildings.
Can you speak to what subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, you think should be reduced or removed?
Well, as I said in the report, right now, for 2015, Ontario gave $628 million every year in tax breaks to subsidize fossil fuel consumption. Now, most of that goes to aviation, which is a particularly difficult problem because aviation competes across national boundaries. But what we've said is it's time to review the tax code and to see whether those tax expenditures can be used better. So, for example, for farmers get 28 million out of that 628 million. Instead of subsidizing the use of fossil fuels on farms, there probably are better tax uses for that 28 million still to support farmers. But, for example, perhaps it would be better to use it to support the ecosystem services that farmers provide when they protect creeks and water quality and habitat.
Commissioner, I just wanted to ask you about your estimation of how much money could be saved if public buildings were all as efficient as
the top order. Yes.
Yeah. So how can you just try to characterize this a little bit? Like, how serious of a problem is this? And then if you could tell me a bit about how achievable it would be to actually conserve $450 million a year worth of energy.
It probably, some of it will be easy and some will be hard. What we do know is that as the public buildings have come to grips with their energy consumption, partly due to this law, it's requiring them to look at it, many of them have found opportunities that they just simply didn't expect. I met with the Commissioner of Environmental Services for the region of York last week, and she was telling me they're saving $40,000 a year just by changing the way they pump water out of their sewage wet well. It didn't cost them anything, they just had to figure it out. There are other things that take money, and we've made a recommendation as to how to make it more feasible for public bodies to borrow money so that which they can pay back out of their savings. But one of the big problems is the split incentive problem, that very often the government funding budget that pays for the energy bills and the government funding budget that pays for capital improvements don't come out of the same pocket. And that means that they can't use the savings to pay for the improvements, so they don't do it. We also have a lot of situations like our own office where we're a tenant in somebody else's building and we don't have a sub-meter. So we're being charged for energy use in the whole building no matter how efficient we are. And it's that kind of procedural barrier that the government needs to address, which is one of the things we've recommended. And we think that we'll find, if we can unblock the initiative and passion of many public administrators, we'll see some real improvements. At least that's what we're hearing from the people we're meeting.
And is it a scenario where there's a lot of buildings that are just leaky, or what's the issue with these buildings?
Oh, all kinds of issues. On the simple side, I've heard of one case where an administrator left and the new administrator didn't know how to turn off the snow melter. Okay, so it ran all year. There certainly are other buildings where the windows are old and the windows leak a lot of energy. There's probably a lot of public buildings that don't have heat recovery. If you think of all the heat in hot water, and if it just goes down the drain hot, it's not doing the sewer any good, but it could be recovered to use in the building. Sometimes it's inefficient boilers and chillers, and they're relatively easy to change. Sometimes it's a question of learning how to program the building better. And sometimes it's really old-fashioned things, like having a curtain or an awning on the window so that you don't get as much heat in on a hot summer afternoon.
What about how public buildings compare to privately owned buildings? Have you looked at that, or is one more wasteful than the other?
Well, what we know is that 90-odd% of the energy used in buildings are used in private buildings. And right now, we don't know what energy is used in private buildings. There are a number of very good performers who've joined voluntary programs, and I've talked about some of those in this report, and what they have found is that there's lots of room to improve, and they challenge each other to improve, and they're able to improve. But the people who join the voluntary programs generally are the best performers anyway. So my suspicion is, well, there's a couple of things. I suspect that private buildings are as variable as public buildings, and that there will be lots of room to improve in the poorer performing buildings. It's also true that some public buildings are really big energy consumers because they operate 24/7 in ways that some private buildings might not. Like a hospital operates all the time, a wastewater treatment plant operates all the time, and so they will have needs that others won't. But in terms of the range of opportunities for improvement, I'm sure we can find them all over the economy.
You say here that Ontario is likely to miss its target to have 5% of passenger vehicles electric by 2020. What led you to that conclusion?
Well, we have a very, very low level of electric penetration here right now. And we're very late getting to the party in terms of trying to improve. A number of countries around the world have been really aggressive at looking for opportunities, and even Quebec is ahead of us in terms of promoting electric vehicles, and not just passenger vehicles, but things like school buses. School buses are a really good example of something where you have a public health benefit as well as the environmental benefit, because the people who take school buses are the most vulnerable. They're the children who are the most sensitive to air pollution. So if you take a diesel-fired bus, and there's lots of fine particulates and other things in diesel emission, and you have the door opening and closing and opening and closing and opening and closing, so some of the emissions are getting into the bus and the kids are sitting in the bus, and then the bus goes and it idles outside the school, sometimes near the air intake of the school. You've got a lot of impact on children's health that is completely unnecessary now. The children could be protected much better with electric buses. They're quieter, they're better at starting and stopping, and there's 2 companies in Canada that are making them.
What about passenger vehicles? Does the government need to focus more on rebates or charging infrastructure, or what's the best way to improve the uptake?
Well, we didn't pick any one best way. What we did identify is that Ontario is in a really good position to electrify transportation, and that if we're serious about it, we've got an opportunity to catch the wave. Now we've got GM and Ford coming out with new models. Tesla, as everybody knows, has promised sounds like an extraordinary car in a year or two. And so this is a time when we could look at all the tools. And one of them definitely is, I think there's a temporary role for targeted and transparent subsidies. But there are other things like convenience factors, which are attractive to people. And I think the public charging stations make a lot of difference as well. People who are going to consider plug-in only vehicles as opposed to plug-in hybrids need to know that they'll be able to charge. And so the more chargers there are, the less range anxiety should be a concern. I think it would also be very helpful if the government were to lead the way. As I indicate in the report, the government promised to buy 500 electric vehicles, and so far they're at 70, and 14 of those are essentially golf carts.
Where are those golf carts located?
Parks.
How much of your report is going to be rendered moot when the government comes out with its climate change action plan?
Maybe quite a bit.
I mean, I should have worded the question slightly differently. How important, in terms of like meeting these targets, is that action plan going to be?
The action plan, I suspect, is going to be extremely important. It is one of the challenges, as you probably can all imagine, by the time we translate and lay out and make AOTA compliant and prepare a report like this, a couple of months go by, and in the meantime, things are changing at warp speed. So, for example, I recommended that the government should seriously consider accepting the Crombie recommendations, and before we even get here, they're on the web proposing to accept a lot of the Crombie recommendations. So I guess the good news is they're doing what I've asked them to do. They just did it before I got here.
Did they consult you at all, though, on the action plan?
No.
They didn't ask your opinion on any of the contents of that plan?
They have not asked my opinion. All right, well, thank you very much for your attention, everybody. Don't miss Emily's map demo. Definitely check out your hometown and see who are the energy hogs wherever you come from. Thanks very much.